Hello and welcome back to the lecture on macroeconomics for managers. And in this lecture, we're going to cover the topic of exogenous and endogenous variable. Now, we have spoken about variables in macroeconomics and we have spoken about models in macroeconomics. We have seen how unemployment and inflation, if we want to sort of build a relationship between these two variables, how that works in different contexts. And we actually talked about a pretty consistent pattern or phenomena that we see, and that is explained by Phillips curve. Now, when we want to build a model, in general, we have two types of variables, and it is important to know these two types because oftentimes these differences would matter in the sense that we need to understand which variables are kind of given in a model and which variables actually are a result of a model. Okay, and these variables are called exogenous and endogenous variables. So by definition, if I want to define exogenous variable, so exogenous variable would be those variables which are given in a model. Exogenous variable would be those variables which are given or fixed in a model. So the values of the variable and everything, the model has nothing to do in determining those values of the variable. Okay, um, and these exogenous variables in turn influence the endogenous variables. So let's say they are fixed or given. I mean, these are the terminologies that we use, or not determined, not determined, not determined by model, or things like that. I mean, you can sort of make a sense, and I'm just going to give you an example on that. Whereas endogenous variables are those variables which are byproduct of the model, so which are actually outcome of the model, not byproduct, but rather outcome of the model, or determined in the model. So determined by the model, determined by the model. And they are basically the result of interaction of the exogenous variables, or there could be sort of interaction with exogenous and endogenous variables as well. Okay, so let's say results from the interactions of exogenous or endogenous variables, or exogenous and endogenous variables. Okay, and let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this exogenous and endogenous variable. Let's go to the very basic thing that you have learned is, let's say, case one. I'll again sort of use different examples. Case one, let's say case one is demand function. We remember demand function, the very simple demand function, where demand is basically, we plot demand as a, in terms of price and quantity, and we know how the demand function looks like. Price and quantity. Now, how do I actually write a demand equation? We write, it is like, we can either write Q as A minus BP, right? So it's a negative slope. So here Q is some sort of function of P, right? So that means as and when we put different values for P, we'll get a value of Q. So in this case, P is exogenous. P is given, the price is given, whereas the Q is endogenous. Okay, so Q is actually derived from the model. Now let's say we actually write the equation slightly differently. Say we write, say this is 1, 2, and now we write the equation slightly differently, where I write P is equal to A minus Q by B. So I just sort of reorganize the equation and I write it as equation 3. Here I actually express P is some sort of function of, say, G of Q, right? So here I provide the value of Q and I get the P, right? So basically in this equation, P is becoming my endogenous. So P is endogenous variable, whereas Q is exogenous variables. Q is exogenous variable. So essentially what you see here is that the way we, write the equation, we can basically, define one equation as endogenous, one variable as endogenous or exogenous. And particularly for this supply demand equation, things are a little tricky, where we can actually express one variable in terms of the other, or we can actually express both variable as endogenous variable. We're just going to show you that. So let us take the case 2. Let us say supply equation. Okay, supply equation, a supply function. So here again we'll sort of write down, we'll sort of draw the supply function, how it looks like. So very simple supply function, where price and quantity are positively related. And here what you'll see is I'll write down the equation P equal to, say, M plus NQ, for example. Okay, and similarly we can sort of here express P as a, say, function of Q, or alternatively we can also write, by reorganizing the equation, Q as function of, say, let's say another function, I don't know, J, for example, J of Q. Okay, J of P. So all this different. So again here I will have this is my endogenous, and this is my exogenous. Okay, here again this is my endogenous, and this is my exogenous. Now we can have another equation where we can actually sort of have both the variables as endogenous variables. So where I can actually have say a pair of equations where I really don't know the value of P or value of Q, but I have to determine the value of P or Q. So let's say P equal to, so this is my demand equation, and this is my supply equation, for example. And by solving these two equations, we can actually get both P and Q. So we really don't have value of P or Q, but once we solve, by solving, we get P and Q, and that is why, because both P and Q are result of the model, so that is why both P and Q are endogenous. Okay, so that is what you have to understand. The way we are going to determining the model, the way we are actually treating a variable as exogenous and endogenous, we basically build our model accordingly. P and Q are endogenous. Okay, now let us give you another example. Let us say we have so let's kind of generalize the whole thing. Let's say we have all those factors which influences, say, demand or supply. Let's say the demand equation again, or demand function or equation with all those different external variables that actually influences the demand function. And those external variables are, for example, let's say taste or preference. These are all our basic microeconomics. Taste or preference. So these are the functions which are actually going to shift the demand curve. Taste or preference. Number of consumers. If I have more number of customers, the demand curve will shift to right. Then we'll have income effect. So we know there are different ways we can have income effect. I'll not discuss income effect here. Income effect. Then we have price of the substitutes. Again, I'll not explain it in details, but we know the price of substitutes actually causes the demand curve to shift. So I'm presuming we all know about this, these basic things. Then we have other complementary products, not just substitutes, but complementary products also, complementary goods. Then we can have expectation, right? So expectation. So all these factors actually influences the demand curve, the shift of demand curve. And if I actually plot the demand curve, what I'll see is, if I actually write the equation. So now, I have the liberty to write the equation. Say if I want to say, like function of, say, price, like we had, but all this, along with price, I have all these different factors. Okay. So I can express this way, and if I have the value of price available to us and all this value of these different variables available to us, I can determine Q. So in this case, my Q is exogenous, right? Sorry, Q is endogenous. Q is endogenous. Q is endogenous, and whereas P is exogenous. Exogenous. And all these other variables that is already given in the model, these are all exogenous, right? Similarly, I could have actually expressed P in terms of some G of say Q and all these other variables, right? So what I would have had is that, let me reduce the size. So here my again this P is my endogenous, Q is exogenous, and the rest of the variables are exogenous. It can also happen that both P and Q are endogenous, and whereas I solve all these equations to actually get P and Q, I will have P and Q endogenous, and rest of the other variables are exogenous. So depending on how I'm going to use these variables, what values I have, whether that is going to be that is going to come from outside or not. So all these things are actually determining what is exogenous variable and what is endogenous variable.